You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm Adam Wild, co-director of the Cornell Maple Research and Extension Program at Cornell University. Joining me is my colleague and co-host, Aaron Whiteman. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be back, especially at this time of year when our thoughts are turning more seriously to the sugaring season and all the tasks that need to get done over the next few months.
Yeah, that next maple season will be here before we know it, so it's best to finalize those last-minute plans now. One goal I've been working on in recent years is trying to make the Clyne forest more efficient during the maple season.
Yeah, that's a great goal, Adam. And I recall that during our last episode, you hinted at work you've been doing on preserving maple sap through refrigeration. And I know that since we added equipment to chill maple sap at the Arnott forest, it's really increased our efficiency and provided flexibility in our workflow.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that, Aaron. Today's a great time to chat about chilling maple sap to improve efficiency, but also maintain quality during these abnormally warmer temperatures we're now experiencing during the maple season.
Yeah, so let's start by talking about those two issues that make today's conversation especially important. And those are labor constraints and warm weather during the sugaring season. So maybe let's talk about labor first. What's the implication for refrigerating sap on labor?
Yeah, so being able to refrigerate either sap or the concentrated sap from the reverse osmosis provides a lot more flexibility in that you don't have to boil down that sap like that day. Like, I've got to make this and finish it off because it might spoil by tomorrow, where I can chill it down and I can go home and have dinner with my family. Or another aspect is, especially for a lot of maple producers who work, jobs off the farm, it gives you that more flexibility that it's like, I don't have to come home from my job and boil after work when I'm tired. I can chill it down and maybe wait until the weekend potentially.
Right. And that alters the kind of fundamental math of processing sap. I mean, the basic constraint is that sap is perishable. And in the past, we have to boil when the sap comes. And just untethering the boiling schedule from when the sap flows is a huge advantage when you can just schedule your boils around your availability versus having to boil when the sap comes in. That's such a big game changer.
Yeah, I think so. And I think in the maple industry, we've for so long been ingrained in this mentality that it's go time during maple season and we just need to burn the candle at both ends and just work as hard as we can. Sleep's not that important. But I think with new technology that's out there, and some of it's not even all that new, but technology we can adapt in the maple industry that provides that flexibility and allows us to, obviously we still have to collect the sap based on the weather, but the actual processing, we can control some of those factors a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it's important to take care of your health during the sugaring season. Quality of life is important, and burning the candle at both ends takes a toll. And at some point, it's just a hard limit. Like, it's a limit to growing your operation any bigger. It can be a physical limit that you hit. And being able to have refrigeration really takes a lot of that burden off you as a producer. Not to mention the fact that it's hard to find help, right? A lot of people just don't have the ability to hire in a little bit of extra help during the season to cover like boiling time if you have to go to your other job. So this really alleviates a lot of those problems around labor availability.
So one labor saving that I experienced at the Clyne forest just this past year is typically we were boiling at least 30 times during the maple season or more. And this past season, we still had a decent maple crop. We only boiled 18 times. And if I factor in, like, when you're making maple syrup, when you're going to the boiling process, that it doesn't matter if you make 5 gallons of syrup or you make 500 gallons of syrup. Usually the setup and the cleanup is the same amount of time. So I estimated that I saved at least 24 hours in labor time during the season because of having less boils. They were bigger boils when I did it, but there was less of them overall.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's so frustrating when you get enough sap that flows in that you need to process it, but you make maybe half a drum of syrup, so you don't even fill a drum, and then you have to break down the filter press and all that. So being able to avoid that is a huge time saver for sure.
Yeah, and I think another factor that I like to think about too is that, we should really be spending time out in the woods when sap's running if we can, not just sitting in the sugar house boiling sap down. So out there, fixing vacuum leaks if we have them, if we have a vacuum system. And so I think you can potentially improve efficiency because you're not just tying up labor in the sugar house. You're out there fixing those vacuum leaks, and then maybe you can boil that sap. Like what I did this past season, I would kind of, if I knew I had 2 days of good sap runs, I'd be out in the woods and I'd save it up and then boil when we had a day that it got colder where we weren't going to be in the woods anyways.
Yep, that's a great strategy. And especially when, as many have said before me, our money is made in the woods. That's where we make money. Everywhere else, we're spending money. So if we can be out there in the woods, making sure we get as much sap as possible, then we're making more money.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, Aaron. Switching gears a little bit, we said the other topic we wanted to cover is thinking about sap quality, especially during these warmer temperatures. And so what are some areas that you've experienced where refrigeration kind of helps improve quality of the finalized syrup?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the main reason that we have problems with sap quality is spoilage. And spoilage is caused by microbes. So anytime the sap is warmer, the microbes will proliferate faster and spoilage will happen more rapidly. So temperature is really the way we can control the rate of spoilage. And that becomes a real big issue when we have these warm spells during the sugaring season. Now, if you go to cornellsaprun.com, our sensor network, you'll see that there are also some temperature probes in some of our tubing that show the sap temperature data. And last season, for example, through March, we had, I think, 7 days where the sap was over 70 degrees in the tubing in the woods. And if you think about that, like a warm, sugary solution filled with microbes flowing through the tubing, it's going to spoil a lot just in the woods. So it's important that we can stop that spoilage process as soon as possible when it gets to the sugar house.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Aaron. And so I think that's where refrigeration is becoming more important as we see these kind of spikes in temperature than what we maybe historically used to have during the maple season. So what's your thought on chilling sap versus concentrate?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think in an ideal world, we would chill the sap as soon as it comes into the sugar house. But sap comes in huge volumes, and it's hard to have the capacity to chill sap at that rate. And so it seems just more feasible, at least in my sugar house and my operation, to chill the concentrate because it's such a lower volume. We usually concentrate up to 15 to 20%. So we're reducing a pretty big amount of the water. And it just makes chilling so much easier because with a milk tank, it chills it rather slowly.
Yeah, and it's also, just you can still run your RO potentially more, or maybe even sizing a smaller reverse osmosis to run more often. Whereas I think in a lot of the maple industry, we usually put in these really big reverse osmosis. We want to get through it really quickly and maybe match the evaporator and stuff like that. But if you can be, run it maybe at the same rate that your sap's coming in and getting it right into that chiller tank where it's less that you have to chill down and store.
That's true. Yeah, if you're chilling concentrate, then you'd want to start concentrating as soon as you have sap, but that can create problems if you're turning the machine on and off over and over again. Whereas if you had a smaller machine, you could just turn it on and let it continuously run. So that's an interesting point. That's a lot of things to line up and make like synchronize, but that would be ideal to be able to do that.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of thought, and it changes the system. I think the way we think about processing, but I think it's good in the industry that we think outside the normal box and other ways that we can set up things.
Yeah. But in general, since we're not the only ones doing this, experimenting with chilling or using chilling, it seems like the people that are doing this are chilling concentrate, right? I have not encountered any operations where they're actually chilling the sap that comes into the sugar house. Have you?
I know one person that's considering putting that in the future, but has not yet. I think on a smaller scale producers, more the backyard producers, I think there's great potential where they're maybe not ROing as much, or they're, not collecting as much. So they're not storing thousands of gallons, but maybe they, over a course of a week, they can collect 1,000 gallons, or maybe not even that much, and chilling down just that sap, that unprocessed sap. And then maybe on the weekend when they have time, they're going to run it through their RO and boil it at the same time. So in a larger commercial operation, less likely at this time, although I have talked to some folks that are thinking about it. But I think in those small scale operations, there's some great potential there.
Yeah, especially in the era of climate change, because it used to be that, we'd say to small producers, well, put your tank somewhere where you can pack snow around it, or put it in a shady spot, or, leave jugs of water out overnight to freeze, then put the ice in your tanks or whatever. But a lot of those options just don't work anymore when we're having these days where it's 60 and 70 degrees for multiple days in a row, right in the peak of the sugaring season. So at a small scale, if you only have a small volume of sap, it is definitely an option to be able to just chill the whole thing without concentrating it. That's a good point.
Yeah, and those are the folks that I think especially, may not want to be boiling every night to process that. So I think that's a really great application there. The other thing that I think might have some application a little bit is passing it through a heat exchanger, which we'll talk about probably in a little bit. I don't want to get into it too much right now, but a heat exchanger potentially as it's coming in, maybe into your sap tank, that chills it down a little bit, especially on those days when it's 70 degrees, as you mentioned you had, several times with the Arnott Forest last season. I think you could bring it down a little before it goes in the RO, and then you concentrate it, and then you really chill it down more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. We've been talking generally about the benefits of refrigeration. Should I describe the system at the Arnott maybe, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that system?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
So several years ago at the Arnott Forest, with help from some supporters, including Western New York Maple Producers Association and an ACER grant and Appalachian Regional Commission, we had a few different funding sources. We got some refrigerated tanks, and we got, in particular, the one we ended up using was a 1,000 gallon Mueller used dairy tank. And it had a compressor with it, and it had two sets of plates in it. So if you're unfamiliar with a dairy tank, usually they have like the plates or the cooling portion of the tank, and there are sometimes two sets in the tank. And we only hooked up one set of plates because we're not chilling down. I don't know how warm milk is when it comes out of a cow. It's pretty warm.
It's like almost 100 degrees. Yeah.
Right. So we're not chilling down 100-degree milk. We're chilling down 40-degree sap or concentrate during the colder season. So we didn't think we needed both the sets of plates. So we hooked it up with one set of chiller plates and the compressor, and we spent $7,500 on the tank and the compressor. And then we had to hire a contractor to hook it up and pressure test it and make sure everything was good. So we hired a local dairy company, and that cost another $4,500, which was a lot more than I expected, but everything worked. And the way we have it set up is our sap comes in, gets pumped out to the tanks outside. We send it through the RO, and then from the RO, it was going directly to the dairy tank. And once the tank had enough sap in it, enough concentrate, usually at about 15 to 20%, then we would turn on the tank, and we have an agitator in there, the little paddle that circulates the sap. And it worked pretty well. It was a little bit slow to cool the sap down if it was coming in fast or if the sap was really hot. But in general, within about 12 hours, we could have that sap down to about 32 degrees, which is where it started to slush a little bit, close to 30 degrees. But we did encounter some problems. I don't know if I shared those problems with you, Adam.
Not as much. I think you've hit some of those problems, but I think we've talked more recently about it.
Yeah, and I think the biggest one is because of our space constraints and everything, we have our tank outside. So the compressor and the tank are outside. That's fine when we're trying to chill the sap, but sometimes we would have chilled concentrate in there and it would unexpectedly get much colder at night than the weather predicted. And then we ended up with a big block of ice in our tank. It broke the agitator paddle off because the temperature probe wasn't working quite right. And so we ended up with a block of ice in our tank that we really couldn't get out. So if we had been able to have the tank indoors or in a controlled environment, that would have solved that problem. But that was definitely a problem. We had to think a little bit more about the weather and get all that sap that was concentrated and stored in the tank processed before we got a hard freeze. Otherwise, the tank was rendered inoperable.
I think based on some of the work I've done, if you're targeting that sap to be 30 or 32 degrees, that refrigeration is much, much colder than that. And so it can easily freeze up, especially if you don't have that agitation, right?
Right. You can end up with a big block on the bottom, a big block of ice if you don't have the agitator going, even if the temperature is warm outside. And then if you add cold temperatures to the mix, then forget about it. It freezes really fast.
Yeah. But these tanks work well overall when they're working, right? Like it's a very effective way to chill down the sap.
Yeah, it worked really well. And we actually had an unexpected test of how well it worked right off the bat because we were starting out in a new sugar house that we had just set up when we got this tank. And we had problems with our evaporator. Our evaporator wasn't working and we couldn't get the part we needed to get it back up and running. And we ended up having to save our sap for almost 2 weeks from our first run. And it actually was still good. After 10 days, we were able to boil it into syrup. So that was the biggest test of our system that we encountered. And it saved us 1,000 gallons of concentrate, which is a lot of syrup for us.
Yeah, that's great. I love the refrigeration in the beginning of the season when you're not maybe getting big runs, but you have a little bit and you usually need to process it. But there's, you're maybe trying to get the rest of the taps in or fix the major vacuum leaks and all the things of getting stuff started at the beginning of the season, like you said, with equipment. So being able to hold that a little bit and give yourself a little flexibility is really nice.
Yeah, for sure. It helped a lot for the unexpected contingencies and also just really thinking about that capacity that you have when you're strategizing about how you're going to work for the week, especially at the beginning of the season. Like you said, if you can be out in the woods rather than boiling, sometimes that's a pretty big benefit. And just building that into your thinking about how to use the tank is really useful.
Yes, I was pretty jealous of your refrigerated tank. So I was starting to think about wanting to get one at the Eline Forest as well. So I had gotten a tank and came with this old compressor. It had been decommissioned properly, which I know can be an issue if they're not in the refrigeration lines aren't brazed shut. If you just tape over, that doesn't work. They get moisture in there. But this had been decommissioned properly. But it was an older compressor, and I tried to get an HVAC person to hook it up, and they kind of just laughed at it and said, that's so old. That's not even worth, because refrigeration, the type of refrigerant that actually goes into these systems, they're always coming out with new ones that are better for the environment. And so these older ones kind of go to the wayside and they stop producing those. And so sometimes they recycle it and it's available on the market, but it gets really expensive. And so, this person had told me I'd probably spend at least $4,000 just to buy the refrigerant. And that didn't even count his time hooking the system up. And he wasn't even sure if it was going to work. So I would spend, I was looking at spending $9,000 or more just to get this system up and going. And it may not even work. Mm-hmm. And working with refrigerant isn't something that most sugar makers can do because you have to have a license certificate to actually buy refrigerant, right? And there's special tools that you need to actually hook up a refrigerant system. It's not like just plumbing your maple tubing and setting up a normal tank.
Yeah, there are definitely some downsides to using the dairy tanks, and cost seems to be at the top of the list. I was really surprised at how expensive it was to get our tank initially hooked up and running. And then last year when we went to use the tank, the compressor wouldn't stay on. And apparently we had a slow leak and had to have it recharged. And that was another $650. So when we're dealing with tight profit margins already, things like that can really add up. And that makes it seem a little less appealing to get one of these dairy tanks. If you're not going to make any money, even if it has some benefits, then it's really not worth it. But that's why you undertook a project to look at some alternatives.
Yeah, exactly. So I was starting to look around and brainstorm different ways that I could chill down. One that was thinking about is like chilling down with water. And some people have done that. I think, Aaron, you've experimented with running like water through a heat exchanger from a stream or a spring during the maple season. But I think that's not really that effective, right?
Yeah. The idea is that stream water, if you have it available nearby, is usually pretty cold during the sugaring season. That's a good heat sink. If you have a heat exchanger, which is just like a plate exchanger where you pump the sap in one way and the water the other way, and they kind of pass by each other through a thin piece of metal, and the heat from the sap is transferred to the water is the idea. But at least in our case, the time of year when we needed it the most was when the water was already pretty warm in the stream, and it just didn't provide a lot of benefit. It was kind of a pain to set it up, and it just didn't seem like the most like turnkey solution to chilling sap.
Yeah, it doesn't get you all the way there. It maybe helps a little, and it could maybe be initial stage or something like that for chilling, but it doesn't take care of everything. Mm-hmm. So as I was looking around, I came across more that what a lot of manufacturing and food production, breweries are mostly using glycol chillers. That's where I started delving into looking at these glycol chillers, which glycol is basically an antifreeze solution that allows you to, chill down that solution much colder without freezing. So in refrigeration, we're pumping, it's more of a gas and expansion that's going through these cooling plates, where this is a more of like a liquid water type solution. And glycol is usually mixed with water. We usually don't use glycol straight. And so a glycol chiller chills down this glycol water solution that you then use that glycol water solution to pass through, whether it's cooling plates in a tank or those kind of heat exchanger type units. And so that seemed to be a more adaptable technology to use for chilling down maple sap instead of the direct refrigeration system.
So this glycol chiller, it's just a standalone unit. Does it look like a dehumidifier or something? Like, can you describe it for us a little bit, what it is and what exactly it does?
Yeah, so what's different is that the glycol chiller units are kind of these separate standalone units, unlike in Aaron, you described the compressor system that you're hooking up to your milk tank and you're pumping the refrigerant through. So they're all kind of connected as one big unit. The glycol chiller is sort of a separate unit and you can connect it to your tank, but it's different in that glycol chiller unit, it does kind of look like, depending on the size, they do look like a dehumidifier or kind of exterior air conditioner type units. It's all contained in one unit. You're not disconnecting lines and having to charge it with refrigerant and pressure tests and all that. It's all contained in one individual unit, and they usually have a tank on them. You put your glycol water solution into that tank, and then there's some kind of cooling coils within that little tank. And so there is this compressor with the refrigerant that pumps through the cooling coils that are in that tank that chills down the glycol water solution. So the refrigerant is all contained within that unit, chilling down that glycol water solution. And then they either have pumps or you add pumps or just even a simple submersible pump right into that glycol tank. And then you pump that chilled down glycol out. You can connect it right to a milk tank and it'll feed through the cooling plates and then come back into that tank, that vessel where the cooling coil is, and will chill that glycol back down. So you're pumping in a loop and you can control what temperature you want that glycol to be. So it can be 50 degrees or you can drop it down to negative 10 degrees or 20 degrees or whatever temperature you want. And so it adds a lot of flexibility. You can have a tank that's hooked up directly to it, or you can pump it through a plate heat exchanger or some kind of coil that's immersed right into a tank. So there's a lot of different options that the glycol chiller units provide for you.
That does seem pretty straightforward. And I think the more I hear you talk about these, every time we talk about it, the more excited I get about it, because it seems like such a great and adaptable solution. But I actually haven't looked much at glycol chillers in quite a while. Can you just look online? Are there places to search for them? And what's the kind of general cost range for these units?
So you can find them online through several different companies. I will clarify, when you look up chillers, sometimes you'll come across water chillers versus glycol chillers. Water chillers are typically designed to just have just straight water pass through them. They're usually more for like chilling down to like 50 degrees. So they're not going as cold. They don't have the tank typically on them like the glycol chillers. You could use a water chiller. They're just not going to be as high of rating. They won't be quite as efficient, but they will work. So there's lots of options out there. But it's important to think about purchasing a unit or getting a unit that matches the cooling capacity that you need for your application. So you wouldn't want to have this tiny little chiller and you're trying to chill down 1,000 gallons of sap. That unit wouldn't be able to keep up with it. And so chillers are typically rated in the amount of BTUs per hour that they can chill down.
Mm-hmm. I guess we should dive into that a little bit, but first, for the price range, are they more expensive or less expensive than dairy tanks in general?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it depends on how you're looking at it and whether you have a tank already, if you're needing to purchase a dairy tank. And just to clarify, I have found it to be effective, and I've talked to a couple other maple producers who have done this, where those dairy tanks that typically you're pumping refrigerant through those cooling plates, you can pump the glycol solution through. It works quite well. So you can utilize any kind of existing dairy tank and connect to those what used to be refrigerant lines. And I think where that can be helpful is sometimes some of those dairy tanks, as I mentioned before, that they have to be decommissioned properly if you want to continue them for refrigeration use. But if the lines were just cut and moisture got in there, you typically can't do refrigeration with them anymore, but glycol solution would work fine. So if you need to buy a tank, you can potentially get it cheaper than if you needed one that actually worked with a refrigerant system. And we're not interested in the compressor system that come with them. So I think you can purchase the tank portion cheaper. You can also adapt existing tanks that you have, but actually buying the glycol unit, they are fairly comparable in price to buying a compressor unit. They're probably just a little bit more. So I'm seeing prices of anywhere from like $1,000 to $10,000. The size unit that I needed was about $5,000 or $6,000 for, being able to chill down over 1,000 gallons. So it just depends on how much you need to chill down. That price can really vary, but you still will spend a few $1,000s potentially on purchasing a unit. Where the big savings, I think, comes in is that you can hook it up most likely yourself as a maple producer, that you don't need a specialist, because again, this is this contained unit where all the refrigerant is contained. All you need to do is be able to plumb from a pump in the glycol tank to your cooling plates on your milk tank or whatever you're using. And that's just very basic plumbing, much like what we're doing in our sugar houses or out in our sugar bush.
Yeah, that labor savings seems to be a huge advantage. That combined with the flexibility makes these units really appealing. And that seems like a reasonable price point too. So you're tapping 7,000 trees thereabouts, the sap from 7,000 trees you're refrigerating with a $5,000 unit that will hopefully last you many years. That seems like a pretty good value proposition right there.
Yeah, I think it works out in the long run, and we have people bringing sap to us as well. So, we're processing and storing from over 9,000, closer to 10,000 taps. And I hooked up this commercial unit that we bought this season, and it worked quite well. It still takes time, much like you mentioned for the refrigeration. It takes time to chill down. But I found that I could chill within usually 8 to 10 hours. I could bring down, most days I would have about 600 to 800 gallons of concentrate that I would produce through a reverse osmosis. And that was at 22 to 23% sugar. And so, I'd reduce that down, and within 8 to 10 hours, I could typically chill that down, which I think is effective. I don't think we need to be chilling it down within a couple hours. We're continuously dropping in temperature. It's not like it's going from 50 degrees to 30 degrees all at once. We're slowly bringing it down. We're decreasing that microbial growth, even if it's taking a little bit of time.
And it seems like if that saves you the sap from even one good sap run, or potentially two at the end of the season, that extra grade A syrup might almost pay for the unit in one season, I would imagine, if you have a good run that you could save.
Oh, definitely. And even then the labor standpoint too, right? If that's potentially saving you, I know I mentioned that savings of 24 hours of labor. Like if you calculate that out, paying somebody to work that amount of time or more, I think can pay for itself as well. I was really impressed. And I think with the glycol versus refrigeration, as you mentioned, like you had to put some sap in the tank before you could start the refrigeration. If not, it would create that block of ice because that refrigeration is so much colder. The glycol, I'm typically running it like a little bit colder than what I want the finished temperature of my sap to be stored, but not significantly. And you could keep it at that same temperature. So I oftentimes was starting my glycol chiller and pumping that through the tank and chilling the tank down before I even started my reverse osmosis and started putting sap into the tank. So I think that helps when the final cooling down, that I'm not waiting to cool a bunch down at once, I think, like you are with your refrigeration.
Yep. So many reasons to be intrigued by this technology. And I know that you've worked extensively on this topic and you've published a fact sheet with a lot of details. So I guess some of those details, like getting into calculating the BTUs that are needed, are a little bit hard to walk through in a podcast, but you have all that information in a fact sheet, right?
I do. Yeah, that's all in our fact sheet that's published on our cornellmaple.com website. And it might sound a little bit cumbersome, but it's pretty straightforward. You're just basically looking at calculating the pounds of sap you have, which is based on your gallons and everything, and how quickly you want to chill it down. So you definitely want to look at those to calculate what size chiller you might need, and think about, what's more the worst case scenario, or what's the heaviest amount of chilling you're going to need later in your season when your weather is potentially warmer, the ambient temperature outside, your sap is warmer. And, another note I'll make about glycol is, for those who aren't familiar with glycol, it's used in a lot of different things as well. Our car radiators, the antifreeze that's being put in there is a type of glycol. It's ethylene glycol. We want to be using propylene glycol, and you can actually get food grade propylene glycol. It's a little more environmentally friendly, but glycol is used in cosmetics and a lot of different products. And interestingly enough, some of the defoamers that are used in maple syrup production actually have a tiny bit of propylene glycol in them.
Oh, okay. So it's a relatively safe technology too.
Yeah, that's the other piece I like about it. As long as you're using the propylene glycol, it's a little more environmentally safe. So if you do happen to spill just a small amount, it's better than having refrigeration leaking out all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So the glycol chillers sound great, but that wasn't the only thing you tested, right? In your research, can you tell us about some of the other do-it-yourself chiller options that you tested out?
Yeah, so this goes back to, thinking about costs. How can we reduce the cost? So as I mentioned, you're still potentially spending a few $1,000s or more to buy a glycol chiller. So, I was trying to think, how can we get these costs down even more? And so looking around and finding that there's actually home brewers make their own glycol chillers using old window air conditioners. And the way that works is, a window air conditioner has a refrigerant system in it, and there's a cooling coil on the front of that window air conditioner, which to make these homemade glycol chillers, we're basically combining that with a like plastic picnic cooler. So it's kind of simple overall to think about it in that way.
Yeah, well, that sounds interesting, especially because many of us have those old window units laying around the house or can get one pretty cheaply, but those units usually only go to about 60 degrees. Is there a way to make them function at a lower temperature?
Yeah, they'll function to a lower temperature. It's just the way the thermostats are programmed in those units. So you do actually need to do a little bit of rewiring and remove that thermostat, and you can add a new thermostat to it. I was buying these fairly simple thermostats for like $20 that have a little probe that instead of, measuring the air temperature, I'm putting into my picnic cooler, which I need to explain, I guess, the setup of how these function a little bit more, how they're laid out is that, so you have that cooling coil on the front of the window air conditioner. So I'm removing the outer housing and I'm carefully pulling that cooling coil out away from the unit a little bit. And you got to be really careful. You don't want to break, there's copper lines and they're flexible copper lines, but you don't want those to break or snap because then your refrigerant will leak out and that basically that unit is garbage and you need to throw it out and get a new one. So you carefully pull that cooling coil out and you submerge that down into a plastic picnic cooler. And what the plastic picnic cooler does is it creates this tank that you can put glycol water solution into, and it creates this insulated little tank. It wouldn't have to be a picnic cooler. They just happen to work well, and a lot of people have those laying around also. So that coil is down into that cooler, and then you fill the cooler with the glycol water solution, and then you have a little temperature probe that measures the temperature of that glycol, and you can set right on that thermostat that you want, say, that glycol water solution to be 25 degrees, and it will turn the compressor of the window air conditioner on and off to maintain that temperature of that glycol at 25 degrees. And then you just put a little submersible pump down into that cooler to pump the glycol out and through your cooling plate tank or anything like that and cycle it back through. And you make just exactly, if you go buy a commercial glycol unit, they function the same way. They just maybe look a little fancier with a nicer housing around them. But these window air conditioners I'm finding are really effective for a much lower cost for chilling down maple sap.
You said the glycol chiller, the commercial one, might look a little sleeker, but kind of picturing this janky, torn apart window air conditioner like over a cooler. So I can't quite picture it, but do you have pictures on the fact sheet of the setup?
I do. I've got lots of pictures, the setup and the kind of step-by-step going through how to build one of these and the finished product. They are, maybe a little hokey. I had a maple producer, called it woodchuck engineering. Call it what you want, but it works and it's quite cheap. So just to think about the cost, to compare to maybe spending a few $1,000s. So I did buy a commercial glycol chilling unit, and I think I mentioned that cost me around $6,000, where I'm making these window air conditioners. And, I had a window air conditioner that somebody just gave me, and I had another one I bought off Facebook Marketplace for $100 because I bought it in November. Nobody wants a window air conditioner in November, right? So it's a great time to buy them. And I did buy a brand new window air conditioner as well for a third unit I've made. I've made 3 of these units now. I found a picnic cooler along the side of the road. I traded a quart of maple syrup to a neighbor for another cooler. So I've tried different things. So based on stuff that I've had around, been able to scavenge and make one, my costs, even with putting in the glycol, I'm only spending a couple $100s to build one. I think the most where I bought the cooler, bought the window air conditioner, bought the $20 thermostat. My cost for that unit is still less than $600
Wow.
overall. So even when you're going out and buying brand new components, it's still relatively low. The larger unit that I bought is not the same capacity as one of the window air conditioners that I bought. So I have two of them, but I'm running these two units because, as you mentioned earlier, in those milk tanks, they usually have two separate cooling plates. And so they have two supply lines and two return lines going into the tank. And so I have one window air conditioner set up to go to one plate and one set to go to the other plate. So with the two units, I'm able to do pretty close to the same capacity as that large unit that I paid $6,000 for, and I have less than $800 into two of those.
Wow. That sounds really great. Another thing that surprises me about it is that you can find window air conditioners in the Adirondacks. Isn't it always winter up there?
It mostly is. I had to go a little bit lower in elevation to find them.
It's probably an oppressive heat wave up there when it hits 70 degrees, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And the other thing that I noted is you can probably chill quite a few beers in that glycol solution in the cooler while you're also chilling your sap. Is that true?
You certainly could. You'd have some nice ice cold beer. You might freeze up your beer a little bit. Depends on how much alcohol's in it.
So those sound like great benefits. But I guess the one question I do have about these is you made it sound pretty easy, but if I opened up my air conditioner, like would I know how to find the thermostat and replace it? Like how much know-how do you need to have? Or are there really good step-by-step instructions available somewhere online or elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, in my document, I tried to keep it as straightforward as possible and go through most of the steps. But when it comes to the thermostat area, that does definitely requires a little bit of intuition or know a little bit about electrical, or you might want to find, an electrician or a friend who knows electrical better to do that component if you're not comfortable with it. Because it takes some skill to know to be able to read the wiring diagram and figure out which are the wires for the fan and for the compressor to be able to hook that up. So you do need to think about that a little bit. But I know most maple producers are great at tinkering with different things, and I think would be fine with setting up one of these.
Yeah, that sounds like one of those projects where you just have to be committed to kind of figuring it out as you go to some extent.
Yeah, this is a great time to do it, in the fall or early part of the winter. Don't try to do it in the middle of the maple season. Build it now, get it ready, take your time doing it.
Yep, I agree completely.
One thing I want to note about these window air conditioners, as I mentioned earlier, the BTUs is the capacity of how much heat they're able to remove to cool down a solution. And when you buy these glycol chilling units, they'll be rated for a certain amount of BTUs per hour, and you should be looking for like what temperature they chill down to. So is it rated to chill at 50 degrees, or is it rated to chill at 20 or 25 or 28, which are going to be very different. And so you want to make sure it's going to be rated for around what you actually want to chill for. But window air conditioners, they also have BTUs per hour rating capacity as well, but they're chilling down warm air temperature, right? And as we mentioned earlier, they may only go to 60 degrees. So that's what they're rated for. And as we get colder, it's less efficient. And so I've tested and find that they get roughly about half, or maybe not even quite half, of the rating of the window air conditioner. So if you have a window air conditioner that does 12,000 BTUs an hour of cooling capacity, of cooling down air temperature, when you turn it into a glycol chiller, you're probably going to be somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 BTUs of actual glycol chilling at 25 degrees. So that's an important thing to note. So for example, the two that I have hooked up to my tank that I compared to that commercial chiller that I bought for way more money, they're 14,000 BTU units, but collectively, the two of them together, I'm getting somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 BTUs for the two of those, maybe closer to 12,000 on certain days.
Well, as you're geeking out on these numbers here, I will note that I think this sounds more complicated than it is. So if I can translate what you're saying a little bit, all these units have a rating that say how much cooling they can do. And in your fact sheet, there's some pretty simple math that you guide us through where you can compare that rating to how much sap you have and figure out like how many BTUs you really need to chill your sap. And that would be a great first step for anyone who wants to invest in this technology, right? Is go to your fact sheet, look at the math that you have to do, and do the math to figure out how many BTUs you need to meet your chilling needs, right?
Absolutely. That's the best place to start, thinking about what's the cooling capacity that you need. Check out that fact sheet. There's a lot of information. It covers even some stuff about refrigeration, different types of glycol, the efficiencies of glycols, the ratio of glycol to water solution. That gets into a lot. And I think I'll also throw out there, as you mentioned, I do love geeking out about these. I've spent a lot of time thinking about and tinkering with these glycol units over the last year. It's been a lot of fun for me. And so I'm happy to answer questions that producers may have. Or if you don't have questions and you do set one up, I'd love to hear about it to see how they're working for everyone.
So that was a lot of great information about how we can chill down sap. And I'm glad that you have been investigating these options, Adam, and have that fact sheet, which will be available at cornellmaple.com. Just on a couple of related topics, since we're talking about trying to preserve sap, something that we've also been looking at is more advanced filtration options, right? Because the sap comes in, it's loaded with microbes and sometimes some biofilm and things like that when it gets warmer. And another way to deal with that, in addition to refrigeration, is filtering that out. And one thing that I've been looking at a lot is ultrafiltration, which I think is one of the greatest technologies I've ever tried in the sugar house, because it looks just like a reverse osmosis machine. It just has a different membrane. And that membrane allows the sugar, the minerals, and the water to pass through the membrane, but it blocks the bacteria and yeast. So it's basically a really fine filter where you can actually filter out the bacteria and yeast. And you can have the ugliest sap in the world coming into the sugar house, and it comes out of that machine looking like water. So I think combining that technology or some other really good filtration with refrigeration just gives us so much capacity to keep our sap for much longer without losing quality. Right, Adam?
Yeah, definitely. Especially I think when you come to that processing, like, even if you're chilling it down, you still have all those microbes. Maybe they weren't active and they weren't turning the sap quality and making it, off flavors or anything like that, but they're still in there. So when it comes to processing that into syrup and filtering that final syrup, that's all going to be in there, and that's going to create issues. So combining that ultrafiltration in there, I think, has some great potential components. And it's interesting that you've done a lot of that work at the Arnott Forest.
Yeah, I think ultrafiltration is a technology that's going to become more and more available, especially as we learn how to make do-it-yourself units, because really all you need is a reverse osmosis unit and a different membrane. So it's easy enough to set these things up. You don't really need special equipment, although there is equipment out there that's specifically made for ultrafiltration. So it's just another tool in the toolbox to preserve sap as we deal with these warmer spells. And beyond ultrafiltration, another thing I tried recently was a glass bead filter, these pool style filters, but with the glass bead substrate. And I thought that worked pretty well too. I was really pleased with the volume that I could put through that. Is that what you're using at the Clyne Forest, or you're using different filters?
We're not right now. We've used some kind of pool filter with sand in the past. It definitely gets a lot of volume through quickly. There's some challenges with cleaning. We found, making sure that sand has enough water run through it to make sure that it's cleaned and doesn't have any off odors and smells that get into the sap. Then have you found it challenging to clean the glass bead filter? I imagine with the glass, that's the advantage, that it probably doesn't hold on to the kind of off flavors and smells as much.
Yeah, it is a challenge, but it's easy to back flush it with permeate during the day when you're working. So keeping it clean enough to keep it operating wasn't a challenge. But yeah, like if it sits for multiple days unused, that is a challenge. And I think we've developed some cleaning protocols. I just want to cross-check with the manufacturer to make sure it's okay. But it seems to me that there's no way to avoid putting some cleaning agent, kind of like we use soap in an RO. There's got to be some step like that where we're cleaning out all the biological residue. So that's what I'm working on right now. And I'm hoping we can have some more clear guidance for that very soon.
Great. Looking forward to seeing some updates about that. As we're coming into this next maple season, are there other things that you're thinking about as far as like just even tapping, or when we collect sap, and beyond just the management of the sap when it comes in, but just early on to deal with these warmer temperatures?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the weather we've been dealing with down in central New York during the sugaring season has been way more challenging than what folks are experiencing in Quebec and northern Vermont. We've had really warm temperatures early in the season, like in March, for several years in a row now. And after looking at our total dormant season sap data from a study we did where we collected sap from October through May for several years and kind of crunching those numbers, it seems to me like we would benefit in central New York from a much earlier tap. So this year we're considering tapping half of our sugar bush on December 1st and then tapping the other half when we usually do in mid-January. So it's going to depend a little bit on the conditions. If we don't get more rain and it's still dry, we might not do it. But if we have good soil moisture, I think we're going to go ahead and do an early tap for half our sugar bush and see how that turns out this year.
Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. Although I'm not jealous that you're out tapping trees in December, I'll wait a little bit. But I'm excited to hear the results that you get from that, how that impacts, production. Do you get better production in that bush that you tap sooner, or is it going to dry up later in the year? So it'll be interesting to see.
I can't think of anything better than being in the sugar house on Christmas morning, making syrup instead of at home.
That is a challenge to tapping too soon, right?
Yep. That part we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that we have a nice Christmas morning with no sap. But beyond that, it'd be great if we had a good productive December. So we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah. That sounds great. Look forward to it. More things that we can update to listeners in the future. I want to give a shout out before we go to the Northern New York Ag Development Program that supported some of the funding for all of my glycol chiller research work that I've done, and to the Upper Hudson Maple Producers Association who donated the milk tank that I used to hook the chiller up to.
Yeah, those have been some great supporters for this research. So I'm glad you were able to mention that. And I guess that's all for today. And we'll have some interesting topics on tap for next time.
Thanks for tuning in. See you again next time on Sweet Talk, All Things Maple. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.